Chapter 10. Sozzled. The grandfather clock in the Brocket estate's hallway wheezed out 6 chimes, each one more reluctant than the last, as if it too dreaded the start of another day under Mrs. Penelope Brocket's reign. She sat at her writing desk, quill poised over expensive stationery, plotting her next social conquest with the calculated precision of a spider weaving its web. "Mabel!" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the creaky hallways. "Mabel! You wretched girl! Where are you?" The house remained silent, save for the gentle snoring of Mr. Henry Brocket, who had long since learnt to sleep through his wife's morning tirades. Mrs. Brocket's face contorted into a scowl that would send a vicar running for his prayer book. "I swear that girl is as useful as a square wheel," she muttered, rising from her chair with all the grace of a rheumatic elephant. "Isabella! Marianne! Catherine! One of you useless creatures fetch me that good-for-nothing maid." Isabella, the eldest daughter, sauntered into the room, her features arranged in well-rehearsed contempt. Mrs. Brocket's eyes narrowed. "When you've managed to secure a husband of any standing whatsoever, my dear, then you may lecture me on decorum. Now, where is that blasted maid?" "Oh, Mabel, I believe I heard some strange noises coming from the wine cellar earlier," Isabella replied, absently twirling a loose curl as if her mother's fury was beneath her notice. "The wine cellar? At this hour?" Mrs. Brocket's voice reached a pitch that threatened to shatter what remained of the family's fine china. "What business does she have down there?" Without waiting for a response, Mrs. Brocket charged out of the room, her voluminous skirts swishing with righteous indignation. She thundered down the stairs, each step a declaration of war against the perceived incompetence that plagued her household. As she approached the wine cellar, the distinct sound of clinking bottles and muffled giggles reached her ears. Mrs. Brocket paused, her hand on the cellar door, savouring the moment before unleashing her fury. With a dramatic flourish, she flung open the door. "Mabel, you impertinent, thieving little—" The words died on her lips as she beheld the scene before her. Mabel sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, surrounded by a semicircle of open wine bottles. Her cap was askew, and her cheeks were flushed with the rosy glow of inebriation. "Oh, good morning, Mrs. Brocket," Mabel slurred, attempting to rise and curtsy simultaneously, a manoeuvre that resulted in her toppling sideways into a rack of dusty Bordeaux. "Lovely day for a tipple, innit?" Mrs. Brocket stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. For perhaps the first time in her life, she found herself utterly speechless. Mabel, oblivious to the brewing storm, continued cheerfully. "I was just testing the wine, ma'am. Can't have you serving bad vintages to your fancy friends now, can we?" She punctuated this statement with a thunderous belch that echoed through the cellar. "Testing the—" "Mabel, you addle-pated sow!" Mrs. Brocket finally exploded, her face turning a shade of red that would have put the finest claret to shame. "You've been drinking our best wines. Do you have any idea how much these cost? How dare you?" Mabel blinked owlishly, seeming to consider this. "Well, ma'am, seeing as how you're always saying I should take more initiative in my duties, I thought I'd save you the trouble of hiring a proper wine taster." She gestured expansively, nearly knocking over another bottle. "And let me tell you that 1789 Chateau Margaux is a right treat. Bit dusty, though." Mrs. Brocket advanced on the maid, her eyes blazing with the fury of 1,000 slighted socialites. "Initiative! Initiative! I'll give you initiative, you conniving little thief. I'll have you thrown in the stocks for this. I'll have you pilloried in the town square. Her tirade was interrupted by the arrival of Mr. Brocket, who had finally been roused from his slumber by the commotion. He surveyed the scene with the weary resignation of a man well versed in his household's daily theatrics. "My dear," he said mildly, "perhaps it would be best if we discussed this matter upstairs. Your threats of capital punishment could carry into town, and the morning market is just beginning." Mrs. Brocket whirled on her husband. "But, Henry, this reprobate has drunk half our cellar. How am I supposed to entertain Lady Uppington next week without a proper selection of wines?" Mr. Brocket sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I'm sure we can procure more wine, Penelope. It's hardly the end of the world." "Not the end of the world?" Mrs. Brocket's voice reached a pitch that threatened to summon every dog in Lesser Mudbury. "Our social standing is balanced on a knife's edge, Henry. One misstep, one inferior vintage, and we'll be cast out faster than last season's bonnets." As the Brockets bickered, Mabel attempted to make her escape, crawling on hands and knees towards the cellar steps. Unfortunately, her alcohol-addled sense of direction led her straight into a stack of empty crates, sending them crashing to the floor with a cacophony of splintering wood. Mrs. Brocket, startled by the noise, lost her footing on the damp cellar floor. She pinwheeled her arms wildly, grasping for support and finding only her husband's coat-tails. With a shriek that could wake the dead, and certainly woke the rest of the household, she toppled backwards, dragging poor Mr. Brocket down with her. They landed in an undignified heap atop a pile of mouldy straw, Mrs. Brocket's elaborate coiffure now resembling a bird's nest after a particularly violent storm. Mr. Brocket, his usual composure shattered, found himself with a face full of his wife's petticoats and the dawning realization that the day could only get worse from here. Mabel, witnessing this spectacle, dissolved into a fit of drunken giggles. "Corblimey, it's like one of them fancy French farces, innit? Should I fetch the daughters, ma'am? Reckon they'd pay good money to see this, they would." Mrs. Brocket, her dignity in tatters, but her rage undiminished, let out a wordless shriek of fury. As she struggled to extricate herself from both the straw and her bewildered husband, one thought blazed through her mind. This was far from over. Mabel would pay for this indignity, oh yes. And if she had to empty every wine shop in Lesser Mudbury to do it, she would see that impertinent maid pickled in her own juices before the week was out. The wine cellar, once a silent sentinel of the Brockets' pretensions to grandeur, now stood as a boozy battlefield, strewn with the casualties of class warfare and terrible decisions. As the day wore on, Mrs. Penelope Brocket, her hair still resembling a dishevelled bird's nest and her dress reeking of spilled wine, had barricaded herself in the drawing-room. Her shrill voice could be heard through the door, alternating between berating an absent Mabel and lamenting the impending social catastrophe. "Henry!" she screeched, causing her husband to wince as he attempted to read his newspaper in relative peace. "Henry! Do stop that infernal page-turning and listen to me! We must do something about that wretched girl!" Mr. Brocket sighed, lowering his paper with the reluctance of a man facing the gallows. "My dear, perhaps if you were to lower your voice—" "Lower my voice?" Mrs. Brocket's complexion darkened to a shade that suggested an imminent explosion. "How can you speak of lowering voices when our very social standing hangs by a thread? That inebriated imp has single-handedly destroyed our chances of impressing Lady Uppington." At that moment, Isabella sauntered into the room, her face a mask of feigned concern. "Mother, do calm yourself. Your complexion is taking on a most alarming hue." Mrs. Brocket's eyes bulged, her face mottled with indignation like a thundercloud about to burst. "Alarming? Alarming? How dare you comment on my complexion, Isabella? I've half a mind to— Her tirade was cut short by a thunderous crash from the kitchen, followed by a string of colourful expletives that would make a sailor blush. Mrs. Brocket's head snapped towards the sound, her nostrils flaring like a bull preparing to charge. "What in heaven's name is that girl doing now?" she hissed, storming towards the kitchen with the determination of a general leading a cavalry charge. The scene that greeted her in the kitchen was one of utter pandemonium. Mabel, still swaying from her earlier indulgences, had apparently decided to prepare a feast fit for royalty. Pots and pans littered every surface, their contents ranging from bubbling, unidentifiable sludge to what appeared to be a failed attempt at flambé, judging by the scorch marks on the ceiling. "Mabel!" Mrs. Brocket shrieked, causing the maid to whirl around, a ladle held aloft like a weapon. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Mabel grinned, her eyes unfocused. "Preparing a feast fit for Lady Uppington, ma'am. Figured since I mucked up the wine, least I could do is whip up some fancy victuals." Mrs. Brocket's eye twitched. "Lady Uppington, you imbecilic sot! And since when do you know how to prepare fancy victuals?" "Since I found this lovely book in Mr. Brocket's study," Mabel slurred, proudly holding up a tome titled Culinary Delights of the Continent. "Bit hard to read with all the spinny letters, but I reckon I've got the gist of it." Mrs. Brocket lunged for the book, only to slip on a puddle of spilled sauce. She flailed her arms desperately, clutching at thin air before crashing into a towering stack of copper pots. The resulting cacophony brought the rest of the household running. Mr. Brocket arrived first, taking in the scene with a mix of resignation and morbid fascination. "I say, Penelope, when you said you wanted to liven up our social gatherings, I didn't realise you meant quite so literally." Marianne, ever helpful and oblivious, chirped, "Oh, how exciting! Are we having a food fight, Mother? How wonderfully modern of you!" "Modern?" Catherine exclaimed, her eyes shining with misplaced romance. "Oh, it's just like in my novel. The kitchen maid and the noble lady brought together by circumstance, breaking down the barriers of class through the universal language of cuisine." Mrs. Brocket sprawled amongst the pots and pans, her dress now adorned with an array of sauces that would put a painter's palette to shame, felt the last vestiges of her sanity slipping away. Breaking down barriers. The only thing breaking down here is what's left of this family's dignity. She struggled to her feet, pointing an accusatory finger at Mabel. This is all your fault, you wine-soaked menace. I'll see you out on the streets for this. Her words were cut short, as Mabel, in a misguided attempt to help, reached out to steady her employer. Unfortunately, the maid's balance was far from reliable, and instead of offering support, she sent both of them tumbling into the open pantry. The door swung shut behind them with an ominous click. "Oh dear," Mr. Brocket murmured, a hint of amusement creeping into his voice. "It appears the lock on that door is still faulty. I really must get around to fixing it. Eventually." From within the pantry came the muffled sounds of Mrs. Brocket's increasingly creative threats, punctuated by Mabel's hiccuping apologies and occasional bursts of inappropriate laughter. Isabella, seizing the opportunity with the cunning of a seasoned social climber, turned to her father. "Well, it seems Mother will be indisposed for the foreseeable future. Perhaps I should take charge of the preparations for Lady Uppington's visit?" Mr. Brocket, clearly relieved at the prospect of delegating this particular problem, nodded. "Capital idea, my dear. I'm sure you'll do a splendid job." Isabella began issuing orders to her sisters, revelling in her temporary power. She hurried to her father's writing desk, pulling out her mother's finest stationery. Catherine, fetch me mother's seal. Marianne, have this sent to town and delivered to Lady Uppington immediately. But Isabella, Marianne protested. Mother said Lady Uppington wasn't due until next week. Exactly, Isabella replied, her eyes gleaming with calculation. Which is precisely why we must strike now, while Mother is indisposed. Lady Uppington won't be able to resist coming to investigate if she receives an invitation for today. Instead, Mother has lorded her social connections over us for far too long. Let's see how she manages her precious Lady Uppington while locked in a pantry with a drunken maid. Catherine gasped. You're forging Mother's invitation? How deliciously scandalous! The sounds from the pantry grew more frantic. Henry! Mrs. Brocket's voice, slightly dampened by the thick oak door, took on a note of desperation. Henry! You open this door this instant! I refuse to be imprisoned with this dipsomaniac! Mabel's voice floated out, surprisingly cheerful given the circumstances. Don't you worry, Mrs. B. Found a lovely bottle of cooking sherry in here. Reckon it'll tide us over nicely till someone gets us out. The resulting shriek from Mrs. Brocket caused the entire household to wince collectively. Mr. Brocket, deciding that discretion was indeed the better part of valour, retreated to his study, muttering something about urgent correspondence that simply couldn't wait. As the day wore on, the Brocket estate settled into an uneasy truce. Isabella barked orders from the drawing-room, revelling in her newfound authority. Marianne flitted about, trying to be helpful and managing only to create more chaos. Catherine scribbled furiously in her journal, no doubt penning a highly romanticised account of the day's events. And from the pantry, the occasional thud and muffled argument served as a reminder that Mrs. Penelope Brocket, terror of Lesser Mudbury and self-appointed arbiter of social graces, was currently sharing close quarters with a tipsy maid and an ever-dwindling supply of cooking sherry. As the sun began to set on this most eventful of days, one thing was abundantly clear. Lady Uppington's impending visit was shaping up to be an affair that Lesser Mudbury's gossips would be dining out on for years to come. Twilight crept over Lesser Mudbury like a thief, draping purple shadows across the Brocket estate's unkempt lawn. The household found itself in a state of unprecedented upheaval. The air was thick with tension, punctuated by the occasional muffled shriek emanating from the pantry, where Mrs. Brocket remained imprisoned with the increasingly jovial Mabel. Isabella, drunk on her temporary power, had transformed the drawing-room into a war room of sorts. Scraps of paper littered every surface, each bearing hastily scribbled plans for salvaging the day's possible luring of Lady Uppington. Marianne! She barked, causing her younger sister to jump and nearly upset a vase of wilting flowers. Have you finished polishing the silver? Marianne, her face smudged with tarnish, nodded eagerly. Oh yes, Isabella, though I'm not quite sure why we needed to polish the chamber pots. Isabella rolled her eyes with such force it threatened to sprain something. Because, you simpleton, everything must be perfect. Who knows what Lady Uppington might want to inspect? At that moment, a thunderous pounding echoed through the house, originating from the direction of the kitchen. Mr. Brocket, who had been studiously avoiding the day's chaos by hiding in his study, poked his head out with the caution of a man stepping onto a battlefield. I say, he ventured, addressing no one in particular, shouldn't we consider releasing your mother? Lady Uppington is due to arrive any moment, and I doubt she'd appreciate being greeted by an empty pantry and a distinct aroma of cooking sherry. Before anyone could respond, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel sent a ripple of panic through the assembled Brockets. Isabella's eyes widened in horror. She's here! Quick! Everyone look presentable. As the family scrambled to arrange themselves in some semblance of order, the front door burst open with a bang that suggested it had been kicked rather than politely knocked upon. In strode a figure who seemed to suck all the air out of the room by sheer force of personality. Lady Agatha Uppington, resplendent in a gown that appeared to be constructed entirely of peacock feathers and disapproval, surveyed the scene before her with narrowed eyes. "Well," she sniffed, her voice dripping with disdain, "I see the Brocket household is as quaint as ever." Isabella stepped forward, attempting a curtsy that looked more like a controlled fall. "Lady Uppington! What an unexpected pleasure! We weren't expecting you until—" "Next week?" Lady Uppington interrupted, arching an eyebrow so severely it threatened to disappear into her hairline. "Come now, child. Did you really think your little ruse would work? Sending out sudden invitations under your mother's name? And where is your mother, dare I ask?" A strangled sound, somewhere between a gasp and a squawk, emanated from the kitchen. Lady Uppington's head snapped towards the noise with predatory precision. "What, pray tell, was that?" Mr. Brocket, summoning a courage he scarcely knew he possessed, stepped forward. "Ah, yes, well, you see, Lady Uppington, there's been a slight mishap." As if on cue, a tremendous crash echoed from the kitchen, followed by the sound of splintering wood and a stream of expletives that would make a sailor blush. The pantry door burst open, disgorging a dishevelled Mrs. Brocket and a surprisingly sprightly Mabel. Mrs. Brocket, her hair wild and her dress stained with what appeared to be every condiment known to man, stumbled into the drawing-room, her eyes slightly unfocused, locked onto Lady Uppington. "Agatha!" she crowed, her voice slurred and far too loud. "How delightfully of you to drop here in! I was just telling dear Mabel here about a few years ago at Lady Witherston's garden party. Remember when you got so sozzled that you tried to prune the vicar?" Lady Uppington's face, already a masterpiece of pinched disapproval, somehow managed to contract further. "Penelope Brocket, are you drunk?" "Drunk?" Mrs. Brocket laughed, a sound eerily reminiscent of a braying donkey. "My dearly Agatha, I'm transcending mere drunkenness. I've achieved a stately of... What was it you called it, Mabel?" Mabel, swaying gently in the doorway, hiccuped. "Pickled enlightenment, ma'am." "Yes!" Mrs. Brocket exclaimed, throwing her arms wide and sending a heavy brass candelabra crashing to the floor with an almighty clang. "Pickled lightning! You really must try it, Agatha. It does wonders for one's perspective on the utter pointlessness of it all." The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by Mabel's intermittent hiccups. Lady Uppington's face cycled through a range of expressions, each more horrified than the last, before settling on a mask of icy fury. "Well," she said, drawing herself up to her full, not inconsiderable height, "I see I've intruded on a private moment. I'll take my leave. But mark my words, Penelope Brocket, the entire town will hear of this debacle." As Lady Uppington swept out of the room, her peacock feathers quivering with indignation, Mrs. Brocket called after her, "Oh, do give them my regards, and don't forget to mention the parting about the vicar." The slamming of the front door echoed through the house like the final nail in the coffin of the Brockets' social aspirations. For a minute, no one dared to move or speak. Then, as if a spell had been broken, Mrs. Brocket's face transformed. The drunken joviality melted away, replaced by a look of such incandescent rage that her family collectively took a step back. She hissed, turning on Mabel with the fury of 1,000 slighted socialites and a hiccup. "This is all your fault, you gin-soaked menace girl!" Mabel, seemingly unperturbed, merely shrugged. "Begging your pardon, ma'am, but I reckon we gave old lady up her own backside a right proper Brocket welcome. Bet she won't forget this visit in a hurry." Mrs. Brocket's scream of frustration came out as more of a wine-soaked warble that sent the neighborhood cats yowling in sympathy. As she collapsed onto the floor, launching into a drunken tirade that promised to haphazardly strip shreds of wallpaper from the walls, her family began to discreetly edge towards the exits. Mr. Brocket, sensing an opportunity, murmured something about urgent business in town and made a hasty retreat. Isabella, Marianne, and Catherine exchanged glances before silently agreeing that their bedrooms suddenly required their immediate attention. Left alone with the still hiccuping Mabel and the apoplectic Mrs. Brocket, the drawing-room bore silent witness to the death throes of social ambition and the birth of a scandal that would keep Lesser Mudbury gossiping for years to come.